What time does 7 o'clock meeting start?
7 o'clock. 7 o'clock. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to Position in Neutrality. We start every session of Position in Neutrality with a prayer, and Wayne's in the house to do that for us tonight.
Hello, everybody. Heavenly Father, we just come to you today, Lord, and ask you to direct our thoughts, direct our thinking, empower us to move forward when it doesn't feel like we can. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Thanks, Wayne. That's so poignant for tonight. Tonight, guys, we're going to dig into step one, and I'll apologize in advance. I've never presented a step one to anyone in lots and lots of years, so all size groups, individually or in concert, that we didn't experience some highs and some lows, and sometimes profound lows. It's not uncommon during a step one presentation to feel emotion and sadness and brokenness. So I'll apologize in advance that we're going to take you through it, but it is indeed through that brokenness that we find access to who we really are and start moving forward in power and purpose. Yeah? So first thing you may want to know if you're just joining this broadcast for the first time is, why do we do what we do, and why have we done it for so long? We do what we do because the authors intended, when they wrote AA's book in 1939, they wrote it so that it would replicate the experience of what people did in the early days before there were 12 steps and before any of this other was known to anyone. They wanted to replicate as closely as they could the experience of the first 100. And the first 100, of course, didn't do 12 steps. We're going to find out who the first 100 is. They did the 5 principles of the Oxford group. But the other thing that they added to that was an admission of the brokenness that we're going to talk about tonight. Right? So in the foreword to the first edition, they tell us who this mysterious we is. We see we on walls in our fellowship, right? We admitted, and all these different things. We even have some fellowships that, say we're a we program, things like that. And that's fine. We may be a we program, but they're telling us who we is. And it's profoundly different if you understand that I'm not getting their experience because I didn't do what they did, and who that we is. Yes? Because there's been humans add to experiences. And over 90 years, we've gone from a 65% efficacy over 15 years to something less than 10%, and numbers I've heard as low as 3% efficacy. And we've had lots of advances in clinical science, medical science since then, and yet we continue to fail. And I think part of it is because the simplicity and the profundity of the testimony of these witnesses has been watered down by individual experiences. And I will tell you this, there's a push in our fellowships to say, you got to let everyone do this or do whatever they want to do. We got all these solutions. And I'm going to tell you something. If everything is a solution, then there is no solution. So if you'll read our authors, they say, rarely have we seen a person fail who's thoroughly followed our path, not paths, path. And so we really cheat people out of recovery by not focusing them on this. And that's what we do here. That's why we do what we do. So it says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of the book. So the reason we do what we do is the same reason they wrote the book, to show others. Yes? In the book and in our walk. Does that make sense? Yes. And then it says, for them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing that no further authentication will be necessary. We think this account of our experiences will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. And besides, we're sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. So they're going to suggest to us a change in our manner of living. And they're going to lay that out for us precisely. And they're going to give us descriptive terms of what it feels like as a human to awaken in the spirit to a spirit within us. And so that's why it helps to have someone point it out to us, because it's experiential. And until someone calls our attention to the experience we're having, we don't know that's the experience we're having quite often. I also want to jump from there to another little piece of the book in the forward to the second edition, and why I get so animated sometimes when people miscommunicate, the suggested program, the manner of living isn't about modern fellowship practices. It's about what these authors witness to. And so you understand the reason we focus on the book is that the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous was named after the book, not the other way around. A lot of people think that alcoholics formed a club and then wrote a book. No, they wrote a book entitled Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered, and then they didn't have a name for their fellowship, so they decided to name it after their book. And it's in the forward to the second edition, but since I told you the whole story, I'm not going to even go. All right, so the next thing I want to do is jump over to the doctor's opinion. And the doctor's Dr. William Silkworth, and he was a physician who, at his time, they didn't consider addictive disorder, alcoholism, or other addictive disorders a disease, but he was treating people largely coming back from World War I, and he had made a career of watching them and trying to help them survive this addictive disorder. And so he was operating in this theory of alcoholism as an illness before the medical community embraced it fully, three decades before the medical community embraced it. So imagine what it feels like. You guys ever feel like you're an outsider? Like nobody quite gets the way you are? Imagine being a doctor and a professional person who sees this thing going on and knows there's something more in play, and he's castigated by his peers because of the way he's speaking about it. But that's who Silkworth is. He writes a letter. I'm going to go, let me go through the first letter. I'm on XXV for any of you following the book. To whom it may concern, I've specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. In late 1934, I attended a patient who, though he had been a competent businessman of good earning capacity, was an alcoholic of a type I had come to regard as hopeless. So a leading physician in the field of alcoholism, which really wasn't much of a field in those days, but the last stop on the block, had come to regard this batch that he had as hopeless. I don't know how many of you took it out far enough, but any of you ever get described as hopeless by a medical professional?
Yes.
Any of you ever feel hopeless, whether or not you had those descriptive? Okay. So in the course of his third treatment, he acquired certain ideas concerning a possible means of recovery. So they're talking about Bill. Bill bounced a couple times before it stuck. But on his third treatment, he encountered some people who talked to him about this condition of alcoholism and a solution that they had discovered. And said, as part of his rehabilitation, he commenced to present his conceptions to other alcoholics, impressing upon them that they must do likewise with still others. This has become the basis of a rapidly growing fellowship of these men and their families. This man and over 100 others appear to have recovered. So the doctor said he had regarded them as hopeless, but when they started helping one another, they found that peer-to-peer magic was causing miracles to happen. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I personally know scores of cases who were of the type with whom other methods had failed completely. How many of you went to more than one treatment? How many of you went to different treatment facilities paid for by the state? So these facts appear to be of extreme medical importance because of the extraordinary possibilities of rapid growth inherent in the group. They may mark a new epoch in the annals of alcoholism. So that's a prophetic word from the doctor, because at the time he's writing this, he has no idea that a fellowship's going to grow up. And just in a matter of years, they're going to be saying the story of how many thousands, and we're now in the millions. worldwide, and this was all occurring in a relatively localized area in New York, right? So these men may well have a remedy for thousands of such situations. You may rely absolutely on anything they say about themselves. So you just think about a doctor who's worked with you as an addict or an alcoholic and how frustrated they have become with you. Any of you ever frustrate your medical professionals and counselors?
Yeah.
We're good at it. And now he's saying you may rely absolutely on anything they say about themselves, because he knows them to be inwardly directed in a different way. All right, so then the authors come back in between the doctor's opinion and then the doctor's expanded opinion, and they give their opinion of the doctor's opinion. And I always find that somewhat comical, because I've never met anyone that's had an alcoholism or drug disorder of any kind that didn't have an opinion about almost everything, qualified or not. And so as unqualified as these men and women were, they have an opinion about the doctor's opinion. So the physician who at our request gave us this letter has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views in another statement which follows. In this statement, he confirms what we who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe. So you might want to listen to what the peers knew. Look, we'll listen to all this mumbo jumbo from the counselors, but here's what made a difference for me. You must believe this about yourself, that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind.
Right.
So that's why a lot of modern treatment methods don't work, and why peer models mixed with counseling do work. If the batch is properly mixed, yes?
Yes.
So it did not satisfy us to be told that we could not control our drinking just because we were maladjusted to life, that we were in full flight from reality, or were outright mental defectives. So how many of you have been told those types of things about yourself? And did that satisfy you?
Yep.
No. So we're right there with them, right? We're on that path they're going to talk about later. Okay, so these things were true to some extent. In fact, to a considerable extent with some of us. So I had to admit that I could tell from their observations some of my actions were bizarre enough that I could see why they thought I was not entirely tethered to reality. Yeah. But we're sure that our bodies were sickened as well. In our belief, any picture of the alcoholic which leaves out this physical factor is incomplete. So that's the thing I want to focus on. They brought it up twice. Any picture. It's quite common now to not talk about the next phase of his opinion about how this may be some manifestation of an allergy. So let's explore that, because if I have to believe it in their experience and the experience of the first 100, the doctor said it, now the alcoholics have said it. I gotta internalize what's being said and see if that fits. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I want to go to XXVII, and I'm at the very bottom of the page. It says, of course, an alcoholic ought to be freed from his physical craving for liquor. So the doctor's opinion is that this craving is beyond mental control, and that it may be the manifestation of an allergy. Now, an allergy is simply an abnormal reaction to something. Yes? And so he's saying he doesn't know this for sure. It's just his theory. But we hear people talking about the allergy to cocaine, to alcohol, to whatever. So this is the thing you got to get, because it's the thing I must believe. You got to see if it's true for you. When you ingested alcohol, did it energize you?
Yes.
It is a sedative.
Yes.
And if did you ever drink with people who were normal drinkers who did not have that same energizing effect?
Yes.
Did they ever notice that about you? Did you ever notice that about them, or did you think they were having the same experience as you? Because that's the delusion, right? So alcohol is a sedative. It should not energize you over time. It should sedate you over time. There's an exhilaration anytime I put a chemical like that in my body. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when I had to prepare to drive all night, I took a pint with me. Everyone else is drinking coffee. I'm drinking gin. True deal. Or whiskey. Yeah, whatever. All right. It depends on what you can afford, truth be told. If you did it right, you couldn't afford anything good. Anyway, then it says this physical craving for liquor often requires a definite hospital procedure before psychological measures can be of maximum benefit. So what are they talking about? What's that hospital procedure they're talking about? In modern parlance, it's probably a trip to the detox. Yep. And then it says, we believed and so suggested a few years ago that the action of alcoholics on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy. So he's going to go a little deeper into his theory. That the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class. So what class? Yeah, somebody that is showing up at treatments frequently, not just somebody who thinks you drink too much and so they tell you you're an alcoholic. That may or may not be so. But by the time you're running into these detoxes and getting in trouble and losing your jobs because of your drinking, there's a good chance that alcohol or drugs is playing some role in that, right? All right, and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. So how many in a never?
Zero.
So in case any of you were wondering, you're not an average temperate drinker if you've ever had that experience. Doesn't tell you whether you're alcoholic or not, but it says we've crossed off a class, which we'll get into later, right?
Yeah.
So these allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all. And once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, is that true for you? Have you found a habit that you found you could not break? And some people say, well, I can sometimes. Okay. Break and stay broke, right? Well, I've heard it. I'm sure all of us that have worked with people, we've heard it all. It doesn't happen to me every time. Okay. Do you know which time it's going to happen? No. Okay, then did you ever really have control? No. Denial's a real thing, right? We'll do anything we can to defend our spiritual release. So once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up in them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. And if you find that, what seemed to be just a minor difficulty became a pile of difficulties.
Right.
Then they talk about how we receive information and why peers are so important. The doctor says frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. How many of you had people begging with you? If you loved me, you'd stop.
Right.
Did you love them?
Yes.
Did you stop?
No.
No, it makes it worse. It makes it worse. The message which can interest and hold these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. In nearly all cases, their ideals must be grounded in a power greater than themselves if they are to recreate their life. So what they're trying to get us to understand is not having a horror story and trying to, stay talking mess all night. We're talking about somebody who obviously knows the mess and has been pulled from the wreck and into the freedom. So the depth and weight has to do with, I must know something you don't know. That's why you want to talk to me. And that's why peers work when others can't. Because if we're properly armed with the facts about ourselves, there's no surprises come to us about the debacles that people get into on chemicals. Okay, so if any feel that a psychiatrist directing a hospital for alcoholics, we appear somewhat sentimental, let them stand with us for a while on the firing line, see the tragedies and despairing wives, the little children. Let the solving of these problems become a part of their daily work, and even in their sleeping moments, and the most cynical will not wonder that we have accepted and encouraged this movement. The peer model properly employed is so inspirational that while people will try and get in the way, any logical thinking person will know that there's something magical happens with lived experience that cannot be replicated.
Right.
And I have a fair amount of experience of people telling me that's not true. And I still say the power that directs this movement will always direct this movement. And if you find yourself coming up against that power, you're losing, because that power can do anything but fail.
Amen. Yes.
Just so we're all on the same page. Okay, let's see, I'm gonna run through Bill's story real fast, and I haven't done that in a minute. Bill's story, Bill is the author of most of this book, although it's edited and agreed to every single word by this First 100 team. So you understand this is the true, when people talk about approving AA literature, everything spawns from this experience, and many things have not really been good substitutes. So that you know. So I always focus with people that I'm working with, bring them back to this book. I don't care what you read after you've had this experience. And it's not enough to read this. I don't care if you read it at all. I'll read it to you, but go do what it says and see what happens. So we're on page 5. It says, liquor ceased to be a luxury. It became a necessity. How many of you had an experience of your alcoholism, your addiction just became work? And you knew it. It wasn't an option anymore. Okay, that's what he's talking about. To Bill, this is what it looked like. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3 got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. Any of you relate to that? How long did any of you go through that? Years? Decades? I went through a long time. Long time. I don't even know how I lived through it, truthfully.
Right.
And then he always describes it. He tells you what the experience is so we can get there, and then he tells you what it looked like for him so you can get a visual. It's the mastery of the way this book's written, if you pay attention to what he's done. A tumbler full of gin followed by half a dozen bottles of beer would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. How many of you got up so sick? I got to talk to my drinkers here now. So sick that you knew to get well, you had to drink something, and you knew you were going to throw up the first several belts of it. How many of you were on a budget and you had to capture it because you couldn't afford to get any more? Yeah, if you get sick enough, folks, you recycle that stuff. Yes, it's that unpleasant.
Sounds like you've been there.
And got the shirt. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation. Now think about that. I am so sick in the morning, I have to drink what made me sick so I can quit being quite so sick. But I got this. I can fool them now. And there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. So Bill has got a spouse that's trying to support him through all this crazy. And every once in a while, he'd get sober long enough that she would think, oh, maybe it's finally over. Any of you have family members? Most of us did.
Absolutely.
And we dashed their hopes and we destroyed their faith. You don't think you need a spiritual resurrection spiritually when you've dashed all those spiritual gifts and all the people you care about. Because there's no way you can replace those spiritual gifts. That has to come from within them.
Yeah.
Anyway, just a thought. So gradually things got worse. And then he's going to talk about what gradually looks like. And those of you who have had the experience of going from the penthouse to the outhouse, you can relate. So the house was taken over by the mortgage holder. Any of you get there? How many of you just didn't even bother with the house stage? Okay. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Yes? Did you start to see that around you? Did it start to scare you? Yeah. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point of 1932, and I'd somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went on a prodigious bender and that chance vanished. How many of you did that?
Oh, yeah.
In the midst of a run, you got some clarity. You went out and put a deal together, went out to celebrate the deal, missed the deal.
Yes.
So he said, I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw that I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. How many of you came to that conclusion?
More than once.
How many of you changed your mind before the day was out? How many of you got sick enough that when you got out about 12 hours, you started getting really sick, DTs? Then it gets really hard to keep that commitment. So I was through forever. Before then, I had written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did. How many of you were really serious about it once? How many of you could not manifest any outward action to show it?
Yes.
See, we talk about that. I hear arguments on social media now. I'm never admitting to powerlessness. Well, then you've never been powerless, or you're delusional. But I know what powerlessness is because I've experienced it in this phase. I've had people I desperately wanted to live and thrive who just went and died and took all the promise of their life with them. I was powerless to stop that with all the resources at my command. Now I know how my parents felt watching me.
Yeah.
So I know what it feels like to be powerless, and I have been an executive at fairly high levels, and I'm not afraid to admit it. So I don't know what the problem is. I know a pastor who's born quadriplegic, can't even breathe on his own. He has to have a chair that moves his positions so he doesn't just die in the chair. He has a ministry called Yielded. And he said that the power in him told him he needed to yield. And he cried out, how can I yield? I can't even do anything on my own. But he knows what powerless is. And yet he trumpets the restorative powers that we're trying to introduce you to. Shortly afterward, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. Have you ever questioned your own thinking? Man, I just wasn't going to do this. Why did I do this? He says it hadn't even come to mind. Did that happen, or did you wrestle with yourself? Because both happened. Someone had pushed a drink my way and I had taken it. Was I crazy?
Yes.
Did you ever start to question that?
Yeah.
Did you question why you put yourself in the situation or why you took it?
Both.
Did you question it before it was pushed at you, or were you hoping it would be pushed at you? I'm just trying to examine thinking. There's no right or wrong, but all of us have probably been in all those scenarios. And it's maddening to watch someone who doesn't know how someone like me responds to it.
Right.
I began to wonder for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. So the insanity of addiction, according to Bill, is an appalling lack of perspective. And so it's not all the crazy stuff that happens after I take a drink or a drug. That's just the consequences of someone like me taking a drink or a drug. The appalling lack of perspective is I have plenty of experience that says all of that and worse is going to happen the minute I do this, and I'm going to do it anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's not doing the same thing expecting a different result. I did the same thing with no expectation of a different result and did not care because the temporary relief it promised me was too powerful. Does that make sense? All right, so renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time passed and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. So how many of you had that experience? Got a few days going, had a few people telling you, you got this, got a 24-hour chip, you're cruising right up on 30 days, probably 28 days out. Yeah?
Yeah.
I got this. Any of you had that happen? So when confidence is replaced by cocksureness, what's happened is I confused the experience of grace with the illusion of control.
Yes.
See, I was graced with an opportunity to see again, just briefly so I could enter in, and then I bought into the illusion of control and went off again. So I could laugh at the gin mills. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time, I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it happened. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I'd manage better next time, but I might as well get good and drunk then, and I did. How many of you had that experience? You can see the delusion all over it. After he took a drink, there was no question but he was going to take another one, right? Same as with me. I take a drink, I'm going to take another one. So the idea that I decided after I did it, I'm going to take another one is me lying to me. That's what delusion is. Again, I used to say this a lot. Get up on the roof, jump off. Halfway down, say, I choose to hit the ground. See if it changed the outcome. See if it made you feel any better. The cycle was already in motion. That's why they call it the insanity of the first drink. They don't call it the insanity after the first drink. All right, so remorse, horror, and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. So if they're unforgettable, you should be able to bring it to consciousness. They said the message had to have depth and weight. How many of you had a drink after you knew yourself to be in trouble and can bring to consciousness right now that remorse, horror, hopelessness? Okay, everyone did. I felt a bunch of you have that experience. Those of you online, I'm feeling some of you do that too. He told you it was unforgettable. That's what consciousness is, the awareness of being aware. It's unforgettable. That's not memory. That's consciousness. That's recorded in my soul, that hopelessness. Yes?
Yes.
The courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. A morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. And then he says, that was a hard thought. How many of you got to the place where you just realized everything you had tried had not worked? And the one thing I know from my experience is if I don't try again, I can't fail again. It's a hard thought, isn't it? When you talk about a hard thought, you feel it again back to the soul, don't you? That's the experience of powerlessness, not a theory. Yes? Later they'll talk about how we're, without fight, right? So that was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? No, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Gin would fix that. So 2 bottles and oblivion. So see the appalling lack of perspective? Once the gin started going to his head, all the sane reaction is gone now. Now it's like, we'll fix it later. The mind and body are marvelous mechanisms, for mine endured this agony 2 more years. How many of you got in the endless cycle? Bill was a pretty serious drinker, so you can imagine 2 years, lots of hospitalizations, lots of mishaps, yeah, same as any of us. So sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me. Again, I swayed dizzily before an open window or the medicine cabinet where there was poison, cursing myself for a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. Then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish, I feared I would burst through my window, sash and all. Somehow I managed to drag my mattress to a lower floor, lest I suddenly leap. A doctor came with a heavy sedative. The next day found me drinking both gin and sedative. And people chuckle about that, but we really do get into a conundrum when we start going, and now they start giving me Ativan or Valium, and then I realize that I don't have to drink quite as hard with a few Ativans or Valiums, and then maybe I've hurt myself somehow, luckily, and so I have some opiates too. Let me tell you, I used to take my dirt bike out on the mountain and pull it over on top of me, so that I could go to the ER. And whatever we break, it doesn't matter.
No.
We're coming out of there with a script, and then I can write on that pad and get 10 more. Back then, they left the pads in the thing, and you could. I know you guys might not know this, but you could write your own. There was a law against it, but no one seemed to pay attention. Anyway, so I thought. Anyway, this combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity. How many of you started having people really questioning, wait a minute, I really think there's something more wrong here? He says, so did I. How many of you started thinking that about yourself? How many of you got to the place, there's a place in the hopeful chapter and how it works that they're constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves? How many of you had that resonating in your head and that may be me? But no one ever told you what we need to be honest with ourselves about. That's the purpose of this meeting. It ain't about all that crazy shit out there. The only thing I got to be honest with myself in AA to get well is that I am powerless, and I've had my own experience with powerlessness. And that I recognize the power in me, although in me is not of me. And if I'm willing to do those two things, I'm going to get well, regardless of anybody. That make sense? Because the thing about the power you encounter in 12-step recovery, the power of cocaine for me is that I never had to question whether I was going to take the second hit. Alcohol had the same effect on me. I never had to be convinced to take the second drink. I encountered power in 12-step recovery that takes the second hit. And he never stops pushing me forward once I've acknowledged his sovereignty in my life. That's just the truth. So I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. My brother-in-law is a physician, and through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise helped much. Best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, I'd been seriously ill bodily and mentally. So Bill's hang up, he already had religious prejudice. So his whole deal was he thought that he was crazy because of the fact that he kept returning to it and he couldn't control it once he started. And so his problem wasn't he didn't believe in redemption. He thought that was nonsense. He thought he was doing it. The reality is, if you're born with this disorder, this weird manifestation of this allergy, you had nothing to do with getting it. And you can't drink any other way, right? It's the old story you used to hear the old AAs talk about. I've had an allergy to peanuts, but I never had to eat a sack of them to prove it wasn't a good idea to eat one. But with alcohol, I had to drink a vat of it and still wasn't convinced. Okay, so it relieved me somewhat to learn that in alcoholics, the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor. So this is where the therapist comes in and helps us to understand that once I compromise my will, then it's compromised by that spirit I've ingested. And yeah, it's going to, whatever you thought was your logical capabilities, even normal drinkers don't have that ability. Normal drinkers go out and do stupid stuff on alcohol too. So though it often remains strong in other respects, my incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. So he didn't understand, why do I stop and can't stay stopped? How many of you got stuck just like him? So what he needed was the doctor's piece, that it's just virtually impossible because of what it does to me, both bodily and mentally. Understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hopes. So he thought self-understanding was going to help him. How many of you had some doses of self-understanding, a little smart recovery, perhaps? For 3 or 4 months, the goose hung high. I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. That's what he thought. And then it said, but it was not. For the frightful day came when I drank once more. How many of you had maybe significant time in recovery and then went out again? That's a pretty old story, right? Because this is a manner of living. I need power to live in the face of what this world throws at me day in and day out. If I'm not living for a purpose greater than me, I'm in trouble fairly soon. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. Look at the picture he's painting. You ever watch the skiers go off a ski jump? They're way up there, aren't they? How many of you watched your life go up below your feet like that? Yeah, so he's painting a picture of what happens. Maybe we get a little clean time, then we go do that again, and it doesn't just get bad, it gets bad quick. So after a time, I returned to the hospital. This was the finish, the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that it would all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I would develop a wet brain perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker or the asylum. They did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. That's when the doctor comes in and says, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're gonna die. You got high liver counts. You got whatever else you got, hepatitis C. You've got whatever, and none of that phases us. It was a devastating blow to my pride. So now he's talking about how it makes me think about myself. I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. How many of you realize that? You had done some things with your life, and then all of a sudden you're like, this thing I can't get over. And I've done so much damage to myself professionally and family and community. I don't even know, I can't even do it. I don't even know where I can go to do it again. Now I was to plunge into the dark, joining that endless procession of sots who had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. He's describing what self-pity looks like to the person with an addictive disorder. Do not get caught in the trap of believing yourself a victim. You're a victor. We're going to arm you with the facts about yourself, and we're going to walk you out of this mess. Does that make sense? But we paint ourselves into this victim mentality, and it's a comfortable little place. If only. And we die there. And not quick enough. So no words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. See how he's saying what I just said to you? How many of you can bring that same experience sitting there by yourself? What if only? But that chance has vanished. No words can tell of that, can they? It's lonely and despairing, isn't it? So he says, quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. So he's getting very descriptive now. So if you don't believe in a power greater than you, can you at least get to where Bill did? Because he was famously not believing in power greater than him. He believed that alcohol was a power greater than him. He just told you that. Alcohol is my master. Make sense?
Yes.
Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink, and on Armistice Day in 1934, I was off again. The insidious insanity that he might safely somehow take a drink. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I'd have to be shut up somewhere or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last bout. So he told you about his first treatment, his second treatment, and now he's talking to you about his third trip to treatment. That's his last bout, but he had to go through the cycle. And he said, I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. So you have to ask yourself, what's he mean? What were the three dimensions, height, weight, width? Yes. And then we later added dimensions about that time in science. They started adding the time and space dimension. Yes. And so what he's really talking about here is living presently.
Yes.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Because there's never not here and now. So if we can be present here and now, then we're not living in the fear and the delusion that drove us for years. Make sense?
Yeah.
And then he tells us the experience of it. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. So if you're looking for your happiness, it's in your manner of living and it's in you. It's not out there. And it's progressive, just like my illness was. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the happiness and peace I always sought from chemical or power or position or whatever, I was always looking in the wrong place. I needed to locate it within me and share it in order for it to grow. Near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. Any of you ever sat drinking in your kitchen? With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered if I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. Any of you serious drinkers, were you hiders?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Any of you that didn't know drinkers, we are hiders. Meth addicts, definitely hiders. Heroin addicts, not so much. Usually you don't hide nothing. You're usually trying to get it out of someone else's pocket. Just the truth.
Not always.
Meth addicts would do that too, but they never had pockets. They're always naked.
No, meth addicts will steal the dope from you and help you look for it.
That's just a distraction because they're running around naked. A full bottle of gin near the head of the bed, I would need it before daylight. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. My cheery voice, the cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. So they're setting you up. Bill's reintroduction to Ebby, his buddy, his old drinking buddy. Ebby for Bill is that guy in your addiction that, you always had one around you that was worse than you. At least I'm not that bad yet. That's who Ebby is for Bill. At least I'm not that bad yet. And you got to keep one. Okay. So it was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Now he's trying to tell you it's not possible for this guy to be in New York sober. I mean, he isn't safe drinking with anyone, but he feels safe bringing Ebby over because he knows that's all. It's not possible. You guys got the guy in mind now that's like that?
Yeah.
Okay. So rumor had it that he'd been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he'd escaped. He's trying to tell you how impossible it is for this cat to, he escaped the people who had confined him, not the chemical, right? So of course he would have dinner and then I could drink openly with him, unmindful of his welfare. I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. So he's so deep in the morass of self-pity, he just wants a little joy, even if he's got to share his liquor. That's what it comes down to. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a JAG. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. The very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. So you got to understand what he's talking about. What is an oasis? It may be a mirage, or it may be a body of water in a very arid place. Right? There are oases throughout the deserts, and strangely, there's that source of life oozes out of the ground somewhere, and right? I want to call your attention because the spiritual symbology that they're giving us there, he is teasing like it's an illusion, but this encounter was water in an arid place.
Yeah.
So it says the door opened and he stood there fresh-skinned and glowing. So he's talking about a transformation. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? Have you ever met someone with such a countenance on them that you knew when you saw them that they were not who you had known before?
Yes, absolutely.
Because that's what he's talking about. It was profound to him. And he said, what had happened in his mind? I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. He says, disappointed but curious, I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. Have you ever been disappointed but curious? I really expected you to act this way, but okay, let's play this game a little further out. He says, come, what's all this about? I queried. He looked straight at me, simply but smilingly. He said, I've got religion. Now, I don't care what your religious leanings are. I've known some very religious people. I've met some very irreligious people. But when you're sitting there drinking, hoping to do a whole lot more drinking, and your old drinking buddy sits across the table from you, and you ask him why, what's up, and he says, I've got religion, the fun meter goes, right? This is going to suck. I got a lecture coming. Yes? So he says, I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire, all right, but bless his heart, let him rant. See, he's still in judgment about the experience he's having because he's trying to put it through a lens. You guys that have had bad religious experiences, take to heart Bill's experience. He had bad religious experience. That's why he thought he believed the way he did. And that's why he assumed he was going to get a lecture from his buddy who had traveled across the country to deliver this message to him. And he says, besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. But he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. That was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. So Ebby came to him not to preach, but to demonstrate the healing power he had been introduced to. And he said, I'm going to tell you of a simple religious idea. Everyone hates the word religion. The religious idea is the power dwells in you. And the practical program of action is these practices that are now detailed in the 12 steps of carrying this message to others, properly armed with the facts about myself. Another book talks about his sacrifice, my testimony, the blood of the Lamb, the word of my testimony. I'm obligated to testify to people similarly afflicted for a lifetime for insurance, and because that's how I grow in my recovery.
Yes.
Make sense?
Yes.
So it says he had come, and if you think I'm making this up, he said he had come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. He didn't say he came to pass his knowledge, his theories. He came to share his experience, which happened the minute he opened the door and he stood there fresh, tended, and glowing. It caught his attention before a word was spoken. And then it says, certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. See, hopeless knows hope when it sees it. That's why recovery works. And it would work better if we quit denying the simple religious idea and the practical program of action, because that's all it's ever been. So he talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me, and I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays way over there on the hillside. There was that proffered temperance pledge I never signed. My grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk and their doings. His insistence that the spheres really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. His fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. Bill is trying in the very most eloquent way he could to describe what it happens when we feel the Spirit awakening in us. He remembered, he had recollections of his grandfather's faith, although he did not find his faith in the church. In fact, he told those preachers they had no right to tell him how to worship, even to the point of death. He had powerful faith. He had mountain-moving faith. And that when Bill thought about that demonstration of that man he admired, it welled up from him, those recollections, and it overcame him, made him swallow hard. What religious people call a move of the Spirit. Does it make sense? We're trying to describe for people who may not know that this is tangible. It's sensory. Yes, and he does the best he can, but someone still has to point out to you what's happening because if you don't know, you don't know. And if you do know, no explanation necessary. Yes? All right. So I'm going to jump from there because I'm going to run out of time. I want to get over to I want to go to page 12. And he says, first paragraph, despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. We say power when I say God, so that people that have this antipathy come up can realize we're just talking about power. This isn't a new religious experience. This is just a new reality, the great reality that we're awakening to.
Yes.
Okay, so when the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. People don't like the idea, so the word shuts them down. That's why we're careful to talk to our audience, get centered in the spirit. Yes?
Yes.
And it says, I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of the czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who have felt the same way. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? He said, that statement hit me hard. Why would that statement be so profound to him? His idea of religion was shaken to the core right then. Think about that experience. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning.
Right.
So how important is that admission of powerlessness? Why do you think they call that the first step? It's not about honesty. It's about willingness. That's why I don't like the second book nearly as well as the first one. I never understood why they said honesty was the principle, the first step. I was certifiably insane. I have no capacity for honesty. The only reason I had willingness is that it was beat into me and my creator flooded me with it.
Yes.
Anyway, I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. And so we're going to leave you on a high note because that's where we're at. Next week, we'll take a look at that encounter that he had with Bill in more detail. Thank you very much.